If you watched episode 2 of this series, you remember a minister named Roger Williams, the man John Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Colony expelled into the winter wilderness in January 1636 for the crime of thinking too independently. We left him walking south into the snow. This is what happened next. What he built, completely alone, in the wilderness, starting with nothing, became the freest colony in America. 150 years before the First Amendment. The man they threw out built the thing they should have been. Here's the scope of what Rhode Island became. It was the first place in the Western world to legally guarantee freedom of religion and separation of church and state, not as a theory, not as a hope, but as an actual law. It became a refuge for Quakers being flogged in Massachusetts, for Jews fleeing persecution across Europe. The Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, built in 1763, is the oldest surviving synagogue in America. For Baptists, for Catholics, for anyone being persecuted anywhere else in the colonies. Anne Hutchinson, also expelled from Massachusetts, also in episode 2, came here. Rhode Island was built to be the place everyone else refused to be. Today we're going to cover the full founding story of Rhode Island, from Roger Williams walking alone into the January wilderness, to the settlement he founded on land purchased from the Narragansett people, to the Royal Charter of 1663 that codified religious freedom into colonial law, to King Philip's War, the most devastating conflict in colonial New England, to Rhode Island's role as the last colony to ratify the Constitution, and why that resistance was actually philosophically consistent. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why the smallest colony in America produced the most important idea in the American founding. And you'll understand why a man who was thrown out in the snow was right all along. Back to the very beginning. To understand why Rhode Island became what it became, you have to understand what Roger Williams actually believed, because his ideas were genuinely radical for 1636. Williams believed three things that put him in direct conflict with every authority around him. First, civil government had absolutely no business regulating religious belief or practice. None. Government and church were completely separate domains. Second, the English crown had no legal right to grant land that already belonged to the native people who lived there. The colonial land grant system was, in his view, a legal fiction built on theft. Third, every individual conscience was answerable only to God, not to any church authority or government. Three ideas. In 1636, he was expelled for all three. Williams walked south from Massachusetts in January 1636, through 14 weeks of what he himself described as sorest affliction, the deepest winter, no shelter, no road. He was guided and sheltered by the Narragansett people, whose sachem Canonicus had established a relationship with him during his time in Massachusetts. This is a crucial detail. Williams had spent years learning the Narragansett language, studying their culture, and advocating for their land rights. They knew him. They helped him survive. When he arrived at the Moshassuck River in the spring of 1636, he purchased the land from the Narragansett rather than claiming it by royal grant, one of the only colonial founders in American history to do so. Williams named his settlement Providence, a deliberate theological statement that God's providence had delivered him through the wilderness to this place. He established a simple governing compact among the first settlers that contained one extraordinary clause. Civil authority would govern only civil things, not religious practice, not conscience, not belief, just civil things. This was not a minor procedural point. This was the explicit and deliberate legal separation of church and state, written into the governing rules of a colonial settlement in 1636. Roger Williams invented the wall between church and state that Jefferson would describe 144 years later as if describing something entirely new. Williams wasn't the only person Massachusetts expelled who ended up in Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson, the woman we met in episode 2 who was put on trial and banished for the crime of holding Bible study classes in her home and disagreeing with the Puritan ministers, arrived in 1638 and co-founded Portsmouth, the second settlement in what would become Rhode Island. Then came Samuel Gorton, who was too radical even for Williams, and founded Warwick. Then came a community of Quakers, expelled from Massachusetts with violence. Quakers were flogged and had their ears cut off in Boston for their beliefs. In Rhode Island, they were left alone. This was not an accident. This was the policy. In 1663, Roger Williams traveled to England and secured a royal charter for Rhode Island from King Charles II, and what he brought back was extraordinary. The charter explicitly guaranteed full liberty in religious concernments to all Rhode Island colonists. It was the first royal document in English colonial history to legally guarantee freedom of religious practice. Charles II, who had his own complicated relationship with religious conformity, granted it. The charter was so progressive that Rhode Island continued governing under it, with only modest modifications, until 1843, 180 years, the same document, because they wrote it right the first time. But Rhode Island's founding story, like Connecticut's, like Virginia's, like every colony in this series, carries a shadow. In 1675 and 1676, King Philip's War devastated all of southern New England. The conflict was led by Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, sachem of the Wampanoag people, who had watched English colonial expansion consume their lands for decades. The war was the bloodiest conflict per capita in American history. Dozens of English towns were destroyed. A substantial portion of the entire English colonial population of New England was killed or displaced. And the Narragansett, the people who had sheltered Roger Williams in the winter of 1636 and whose land he had purchased, were virtually destroyed in the Great Swamp Massacre of December 1675. Rhode Island paid the highest price of any colony. Let's be precise about what made Rhode Island fundamentally different from every other colony in the series. 1. It was the only colony where you could practice any religion, or no religion, without legal penalty. Anywhere else, religious nonconformity was a punishable offense. 2. It was the only colony where land was consistently purchased from native people, rather than claimed by royal grant, at least through Williams's lifetime. 3. It had no state church, no established religion, no tithing to support a government-approved minister. In a world where the church and the state were universally understood to be one structure, Rhode Island said they were two different things, and enforced that separation in law. In 1636, Jefferson called this a wall of separation. Williams built it first. Quick one, before we get into Newport's Jewish community, the First Baptist Church of America, and why Rhode Island was the last colony to ratify the U.S. Constitution, drop a comment. From what you've seen in this series so far, which founding story has surprised you the most? Virginia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, or Rhode Island so far? I read every reply. Tell me which one landed hardest. Newport, Rhode Island became one of the most remarkable cities in colonial America, precisely because of the colony's religious freedom policy. Because anyone could practice any faith there, people who were being persecuted everywhere else came there. Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition in Portugal and Brazil began arriving in the 1650s. A thriving Jewish mercantile community established itself. The Touro Synagogue, built in 1763, designed by Peter Harrison and now considered a masterpiece of colonial architecture, is the oldest surviving Jewish house of worship in the United States. It exists in Newport, Rhode Island, because nowhere else in colonial America would have allowed it to be built. Rhode Island's religious freedom produced another American first. Roger Williams himself founded the first Baptist church in America in Providence in 1638. Though Williams was characteristically independent and left the congregation within months, concluding that he wasn't certain any organized church had proper apostolic authority. The church he founded still exists. It is the oldest Baptist congregation in America. And the reason it exists in Providence rather than anywhere else is simple. Everywhere else, Baptists were persecuted. In Massachusetts, they were fined, imprisoned, and sometimes flogged. In Rhode Island, they built the first Baptist church in American history because they were finally, legally, left alone. Let me tell you what happened to Quakers in Massachusetts so you understand exactly what Rhode Island was offering as an alternative. Massachusetts passed laws making it illegal to be a Quaker on their territory. First offense, imprisonment and hard labor. Second offense, ear removal. Third offense, a hole bored through your tongue with a hot iron. Fourth offense, death. In 1659 and 1660, Massachusetts actually executed 4 Quakers on Boston Common. In Rhode Island, Quakers were left completely alone. They built meeting houses. They thrived. They became one of the most influential religious communities in colonial New England. The contrast is not subtle. In 1790, President George Washington visited Newport and wrote a letter to the Hebrew congregation at the Toro Synagogue that remains one of the most important statements of American religious freedom ever written. Washington wrote, "The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." He was not inventing that principle. He was describing what Rhode Island had been practicing for 154 years. Roger Williams built the wall. Jefferson described it. Washington enforced it. But it started in Providence in 1636 with a man walking alone through the January snow. Rhode Island's role in the American Revolution carries the colony's characteristic pattern: first to act, last to receive credit. In June 1772, 3 years before Lexington and Concord, Rhode Island men attacked and burned the HMS Gaspee, a British revenue schooner that had been aggressively enforcing customs laws in Narragansett Bay. It was one of the first acts of armed colonial resistance against the British Navy in American history. Rhode Island also declared its own independence from Britain on May 4, 1776, 2 months before the Declaration of Independence. First again. Then Rhode Island raised one of the Continental Army's most important regiments, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, notably the first regularly constituted African-American military unit in American history. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment deserves more recognition than it typically receives. Formed in 1778 with the explicit authorization of the Rhode Island General Assembly to recruit enslaved men who would earn their freedom through military service, the regiment became one of the most effective fighting units in the Continental Army. At the Battle of Rhode Island in August 1778, the only major battle fought on Rhode Island soil, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment held the American rear guard against 3 Hessian assaults, allowing the main American force to withdraw safely. A Hessian officer reportedly said afterward that no regiment in any European army could have maintained the position they held. 1st African American Regiment, Rhode Island. Because the colony was built differently from the start, Rhode Island's list of things it did first that nobody teaches. First colony to declare independence from Britain, May 4, 1776. First armed resistance to the British Navy, the Gaspee Affair, June 1772. First colony in America with a law guaranteeing religious freedom, 1636. First regularly constituted African-American military regiment in American history, the 1st Rhode Island, 1778. First college in New England to accept students regardless of religious affiliation, Brown University, 1764. And Rhode Island was the last of the original 13 states to ratify the U.S. Constitution, May 29, 1790. Not because it was least committed to liberty, because it was most committed to liberty and wanted a Bill of Rights first. Rhode Island held out until it got one. Rhode Island's decision to be the last state to ratify the U.S. Constitution, by a margin of just 2 votes, May 29, 1790, over a year after the government had already begun operating, is usually taught as obstinacy or backwardness. It was neither. Rhode Island's objection was specific and principled. The Constitution as drafted contained no explicit protections for individual rights, no freedom of religion, no freedom of speech, no protections against unreasonable search. For a colony built entirely on the principle of individual conscience and religious freedom, ratifying a constitution without those protections was philosophically impossible. Rhode Island held out until the Bill of Rights was guaranteed. It was the most ideologically consistent position of any state in the entire ratification debate. There's something about the physical landscape of Rhode Island that feels right for this story. It is built around water. Narragansett Bay cuts deep into the state, creating an enormous network of inlets, islands, and harbors that made Rhode Island one of the great maritime trading centers of colonial America. The sea made the colony's economy. The sea brought the ships brought the people. The Sephardic Jews, the Quakers, the Baptists, the Huguenots, who came because this was the one place they were allowed. The geography was open. The policy was open. In Rhode Island, both were true at once. Here's the insight I want to leave you with. Every colony in this series so far was founded on something. Virginia was founded on profit. Massachusetts was founded on purity. New Hampshire was founded on stubbornness. Connecticut was founded on an idea. Rhode Island was founded on a conviction, a specific, hard-won, personally costly conviction that no government has the right to tell a human being what to believe. Roger Williams didn't develop that conviction in a philosophy seminar. He developed it by watching the government try to control his beliefs, refusing to comply, being expelled into the January snow, and deciding that the alternative he built in the wilderness would be the proof that he was right. The First Amendment didn't come from nowhere. It came from here. Roger Williams was wrong about some things. He was difficult, restless, never quite satisfied with any institution he built. He left the church he founded within months. He argued constantly. He could be exhausting to work with. He was also right about the most important things anyone in 1636 could have been right about, that the conscience of every human being is their own, that government has no business reaching into it, and that the most stable foundation for a civil society is the one that leaves people free to believe as they will and live as they choose. 350 years later, the principles he lived in the wilderness are enshrined in the founding law of the most powerful nation on earth. Not bad for a man thrown out into the January snow. That's Rhode Island, episode 5 of 13. Next up is Maryland. And Maryland's founding story is one of the most surprising in the entire series, because Maryland was founded not by Puritans, not by merchants, not by political radicals, but by a Catholic nobleman trying to build a refuge for Catholics in a Protestant empire, Lord Baltimore, a man who designed the most sophisticated act of religious tolerance in early colonial America, and whose colony almost immediately turned on him. Maryland's founding is the story of tolerance tried, betrayed, and eventually restored. And the document they wrote to save it became the first law in American history protecting religious freedom for Christians of every denomination. That's episode 6. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you there.